The village of St. Mary Mead had always been an unremarkable sort of place. The sort where doors were left unlocked in the summer, and where the sound of children playing in the lane was as ordinary as the church bells on Sunday. Yet despite its gentle rhythms, there was always, Miss Marple knew, a quiet undercurrent of human folly and hidden resentments waiting to rise. It was on a particularly crisp spring evening that the peace of the village was first disrupted. The annual St. Mary Mead Garden Gala had begun in the carefully tended grounds of the Fairlawn estate. The flowers were in full bloom, tulips and daffodils forming neat bursts of colour around the stone fountain, and the air carried the gentle hum of conversation and polite laughter. Guests, many in their Sunday best despite the late hour, nibbled on petits fours and sipped elderflower cordial. Miss Marple herself stood near the hedge, a small embroidered handkerchief in hand, observing the scene with quiet attentiveness. Her eyes, hidden behind rimmed spectacles, flicked subtly from one guest to another, taking note of gestures, glances, and the ever-so-slight shifts of expression that spoke more than words ever could. "The postman has been dreadfully slow this week," remarked Mrs. Pennyweather, one of the local ladies adjusting her lace gloves. "I dare say the villagers' letters will be stacked 3 deep by the time he arrives." Miss Marple merely smiled. She had noticed over the years that the postal deliveries in St. Mary Mead seemed unusually affected by certain villagers' moods, a fact she filed away quietly. As the evening wore on and the sun dipped behind the hills, a hush fell over the gathering. The soft clinking of teacups ceased as a sudden shrill cry cut through the air. Heads turned instinctively toward the sound. It had come from the lane that led toward the village green. Before anyone could react, a second cry followed, more frantic, more desperate. A figure emerged from the shadows, a maid from Fairlawn, her apron damp with sweat, her face pale and lined with fear. It's Mr. Hargreaves," she gasped. He's been murdered." A collective murmur rippled through the assembled guests. Miss Marple, her heart steady and unperturbed, noted the immediate flurry of shock and confusion. People began talking over one another, their voices sharp with disbelief. Murdered? Who would do such a thing? The poor man? Mr. Hargreaves, the village postman, was known by everyone. He was punctual, polite, and liked to exchange a cheerful word with each household he visited. That such a man could be the victim of violence in St. Mary Mead was inconceivable to most, yet the maid's trembling hands and wide, terrified eyes left no room for doubt. By the time the village constable arrived, summoned by a hurried telegram to the nearest town, a small crowd had gathered near the lane. Miss Marple allowed herself a moment to survey the scene. Mr. Hargreaves lay slumped against the wooden gate of the old orchard, one hand clutching his satchel, the other limply touching the damp earth. His eyes stared blankly upward, as if still expecting to see the familiar morning sun that would never rise for him again. There was no immediate sign of the weapon, no apparent motive. Miss Marple's gaze, however, lingered on small details others might have missed. The faint smear of soil on the back of the postman's sleeve, the slightly ajar gate suggesting a struggle, the careful way in which the crowd had begun to gather without touching the body. Among the watchers, she noticed subtle reactions that spoke volumes. The vicar, usually composed and serene, rubbed his hands nervously. Mrs. Pennyweather's voice trembled despite her attempts to maintain dignity, and young Timothy Barton, a boy who often helped Mr. Hargreaves deliver letters, looked both guilty and frightened, though it was unclear why. Miss Marple said nothing aloud, of course. She knew better than to interfere at this early stage, knowing that the first impressions often contained more truth than the clumsy speculations of the authorities. Her mind, however, was already working, quietly noting inconsistencies and contradictions in what she observed. As the evening grew darker and the constable began his preliminary questions, the crowd dispersed slightly, whispers travelling like a gentle wind. The postman's death, abrupt and shocking, had cracked the veneer of tranquility in St. Mary Mead, and Miss Marple could sense that beneath the polite greetings and cheerful smiles, something far more complex and sinister had begun to stir. And as she watched the last rays of sunlight fade from the village, she reflected calmly, firmly that human nature, with all its secrets and deceptions, would eventually reveal the truth. It was only a matter of time. The morning after Mr. Hargreaves's shocking death, St. Mary Mead awoke to an unusual hush. Normally the village would hum with life. Shopkeepers setting out their wares, children chasing each other in the lanes, and the distant ring of the church bells marking time. Today there was only a soft murmur of speculation, punctuated by occasional gasps and whispered conversations. The first to gather at the scene were the neighbours closest to the orchard. Mrs. Dolly Bantry, still in her dressing gown, leaned over her fence to peer at the cordoned-off area. "It's dreadful, simply dreadful," she murmured to her companion, Miss Lottie Simpson, who clutched her parasol tightly despite the warm spring sun. "Murder in our village! Who could imagine such a thing?" The local shopkeeper, Mr. Pickering, had taken it upon himself to relay news to everyone who might not have heard. "It's a terrible business," he confided to Mrs. Pennyweather as he handed over a loaf of bread. "I heard someone say that he might have seen something he shouldn't have. Some dangerous secret, I dare say." The rumour mill churned quickly. Miss Marple, sipping her tea quietly at the back of the gathering, listened intently. She noted who was eager to talk and who seemed eager to hide their reactions. Gossip, she knew, was often more revealing than a confession. Mr. Stringer, the vicar, moved among the villagers, offering condolences with a nervous energy that belied his serene exterior. He had always been a figure of moral guidance, yet the stress of a violent death so close to home seemed to shake him. "It's most unsettling," he said repeatedly. As though saying it aloud would make it more true, Timothy Barton, the young boy who assisted Mr. Hargreaves, had vanished from sight, only to be found later near the village green, fidgeting and avoiding eye contact. When questioned, he stammered, I didn't see anything, really. I was just playing." His hands were dirtied from where he had been crouched in the grass, perhaps thinking he could escape notice. Each villager had their theory, each more implausible than the last. Mrs. Pennyweather was convinced that it was a crime of passion, though none in St. Mary Mead had the imagination for such violence. Mr. Pickering muttered about strangers passing through, while Miss Simpson quietly speculated about old grievances that might have led to revenge. Miss Marple, ever silent and observant, catalogued each of these responses with care. It was not the statements themselves that mattered, but the manner in which they were delivered, the hesitation, the choice of words, the avoidance of eye contact. Even the placement of hands and feet could betray a guilty conscience, she knew, or at least indicate discomfort with the truth. By late morning, Inspector Craddock arrived from the nearest town. He was a young man, earnest and determined, yet clearly accustomed to the idea of a simple case, a burglary perhaps, or an accident. A murder, in his experience, was unusual and demanded swift action. He began asking questions, first to the adults, then to the children, and carefully noting any inconsistencies in their accounts. Miss Marple approached him politely. "Inspector," she said, her voice soft yet precise, "may I suggest you listen not only to what is said, but also to what is left unsaid? In a village as small as ours, even the simplest gestures can reveal more than words." Craddock nodded, slightly taken aback by the elderly lady's insight, yet he welcomed her observations. There was something about her demeanour, quietly commanding, yet utterly gentle, that suggested she had already seen far more than anyone else present. By afternoon, the village green was abuzz with speculation. Shop windows displayed hastily scribbled notices, warning of the murder. Children whispered dark tales to one another, and every corner seemed to shelter a pair of watchful eyes. It was the subtle interweaving of fear, curiosity, and imagination that Miss Marple noted most carefully. She spent the rest of the day walking the lanes quietly, speaking little, but observing much. In every nod, every forced smile, and every diverted gaze, she found clues that would soon weave together into a clearer picture. Villagers who appeared helpful were hiding resentment. Those who appeared calm carried quiet anxieties, and one or two, she suspected, were guarding secrets so deep that even a murder might not coax them into confession. As dusk approached, Miss Marple returned to her cottage, her mind quietly racing. The village had reacted as she expected, with a mixture of shock, gossip, and self-preservation. But now, with the initial hysteria fading, it would be possible to watch patterns emerge, and the true nature of the crime and the criminal would begin to reveal itself. And as she sat by her window, knitting with practiced ease, she mused that even the most ordinary of lives could conceal extraordinary motives. In St. Mary Mead, as elsewhere, human nature was the greatest mystery of all. The day following the garden gala, St. Mary Mead was quieter than usual. The lanes, normally alive with children chasing one another, or villagers exchanging news over garden fences, carried only the soft rustle of leaves in the breeze and the occasional hesitant footstep of someone passing too near the orchard. Miss Marple moved among them with her usual calm, her keen eyes noting everything, the nervous twitch of a hand, the forced politeness in a greeting, the subtle avoidance of certain houses, as if some invisible line of unease ran through the village. Inspector Craddock had begun his preliminary questioning. He approached each villager methodically, his notebook in hand, his brow furrowed as he sought a coherent narrative from the jumble of rumors and half-truths that had quickly spread. He seemed particularly concerned with the timing of the postman's last rounds, the few minutes that might reveal a clue, and the strange silence of the village after the murder. Miss Marple followed at a discreet distance, listening, observing, and making mental notes. The first person she spoke with was young Timothy Barton. The boy's shyness was compounded by evident fear, yet he answered with a directness that suggested honesty. I was delivering letters with Mr. Hargreaves," Timothy admitted, voice quivering slightly. "I left him by the orchard. He was going to continue up the lane. Then I didn't see what happened." Miss Marple's eyes, sharp behind her spectacles, lingered on the boy. His hesitation was natural enough, but there was a certain defensiveness in his posture, a small shadow of guilt that seemed misplaced. She made a quiet note of it, filing it alongside the details of the orchard's gate, slightly ajar as if someone had forced it in a hurry. Next, she visited Mrs. Pennyweather. The older lady was sitting stiffly in her drawing room, hands clasped over her lap. Her voice carried an anxious precision as she recounted her own version of the night. "I saw nothing, of course," she insisted, "but I heard a sound, a shout perhaps, and then the fluttering of skirts. It was dreadful, absolutely dreadful." She clutched a teacup tightly, eyes darting toward the window. Miss Marple noted how the woman's anxiety seemed less about the death itself and more about being implicated in gossip or failing to act. It was not unusual in St. Mary Mead, where reputation often mattered more than fact. A small, almost imperceptible tightening around the corners of Mrs. Pennyweather's mouth suggested she knew more than she said. By mid-afternoon, Miss Marple had walked the entire lane near the orchard twice, observing entrances and exits, noting which houses had lights on or curtains drawn. She spoke briefly with the gardener at Fairlawn, who mentioned seeing the postman earlier in the day, delivering letters with his usual brisk efficiency. There had been nothing unusual then, except perhaps a slight tension in Mr. Hargreaves's shoulders, as though he had been worried about someone or something. While villagers busied themselves with small tasks, a quiet tension lingered. Some avoided the orchard entirely. Others seemed drawn to it, as if proximity would offer insight or protection. Miss Marple found herself watching pairs of neighbors in whispered conversation. One spoke with a certainty that betrayed arrogance, another with a timid tone that hinted at secrets. Patterns began to emerge in her mind, small threads of behavior that, when woven together, might form a clear picture of the night's events. By late afternoon, she returned home briefly, pausing to glance at the postman's satchel, which had been brought to her attention by Timothy. Something about its placement and the manner in which it had been dropped did not sit right with her. The satchel was neither fully open nor completely closed, the clasp slightly bent. A small slip of paper peeked from a corner, and she made a mental note to examine it later. It could be trivial, or it could be significant. Miss Marple's mind wandered over the villagers she had observed. Each had reacted differently to the tragedy, each with nuances and contradictions. Some showed obvious fear, some feigned indifference, and some, she suspected, harbored a curiosity so sharp it might verge on complicity. The human heart, she mused, was a labyrinth far more intricate than any garden maze. The constable had begun to take statements in earnest. Yet Miss Marple noted that his questions often missed the subtle cues she found most telling. He asked for times, locations, and descriptions. Important. Certainly. but he rarely observed hesitation, involuntary gestures, or the fleeting expressions that revealed far more than a spoken word. As evening settled over St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple prepared tea in her modest kitchen, her thoughts quietly threading together what she had observed. The villagers' behavior offered more clues than the scene itself, and she was beginning to see connections forming. A glance exchanged, a detail overlooked, a lie disguised as a casual remark. Somewhere among these ordinary people lay the answer, the hidden motivation that had led to Mr. Hargreaves's murder. She sipped her tea, her knitting resting in her lap, and reflected on the strange quiet that had returned to the village. To the casual observer, it was merely a pause, a respite before the next day's chores. To Miss Marple, it was the calm before the truth revealed itself, a moment in which she could gather the threads of human nature into a pattern unmistakable in its clarity. By nightfall, she was ready. The first pieces of the puzzle had been observed. The subtle hints of fear, deception, and secret knowledge were beginning to align, and though no one in St. Mary Mead yet suspected the depth of the secrets among them, Miss Marple knew that the coming days would pull them all into the quiet tension that preceded revelation, testing patience, nerves, and the smallest fragments of human behavior. The mystery, she realized, had only just begun. The morning sun cast a pale light over St. Mary Mead, illuminating the quiet lanes and casting long shadows from the neat hedgerows and cottages. Despite the brightness, an uneasy tension hung over the village, heavier than the lingering scent of spring blossoms. Everyone had begun whispering, speculating, and in some cases, pointing fingers at those they found least trustworthy. Inspector Craddock arrived early at the orchard, his notebook already filled with observations from the previous day. He was accompanied by Sergeant Simmons, a man more comfortable with straightforward facts than with human nuance. They examined the gate, the disturbed earth, and the postman's belongings, noting the slightest irregularities. Yet, as meticulous as they were, there were subtleties that escaped their notice entirely. Miss Marple watched from the edge of the gathering, her sharp eyes cataloguing every reaction. The first obvious suspect emerged almost immediately. It was Mr. Harold Price, the young handyman who had recently been seen arguing with Mr. Hargreaves over some missing parcels. Price's tall, angular frame and nervous movements made him conspicuous, and the villagers were quick to murmur about his potential guilt. "He's been acting odd for weeks," said Mrs. Pennyweather to anyone who would listen. "I saw him shouting at the postman just yesterday. Surely it must be connected." Mr. Price, for his part, protested vehemently. "I didn't touch him. I merely asked about my parcels." His voice was defensive, but there was an edge of genuine fear that even the villagers noticed. Inspector Craddock, eager to close the case quickly, seized upon Price's agitation as a sign of culpability. He questioned him rigorously, tracing his movements and noting inconsistencies, or so he believed. Miss Marple, however, remained unconvinced. There was something in Price's eyes, a certain transparency and lack of calculated deceit, that suggested he was nervous for reasons unrelated to murder. Her instincts, honed by decades of quietly observing human nature, told her that the truth lay elsewhere. Meanwhile, other villagers became entangled in their own speculations. Mrs. Bantry insisted that a travelling stranger must be responsible, citing unfamiliar footprints near the orchard. Young Timothy Barton's earlier nervousness now drew renewed suspicion, and some whispered that the boy might have been frightened into committing a grievous error. Yet Timothy's fear, Miss Marple noted, seemed more self-preservational than sinister, a child overwhelmed by circumstances far beyond his control. The constable continued his questioning throughout the morning. He asked each villager where they had been the previous night, what they had seen or heard, and whether they had noticed anyone acting strangely. Answers varied widely, often contradicting one another, revealing not only confusion, but the tendency of people to reshape memories to suit their own narratives. Miss Marple spent her time moving quietly among them, listening with deliberate patience. She noted who avoided eye contact, who lingered unnecessarily in conversation, and who tried too hard to appear helpful. Every gesture, no matter how small, became a piece of the unfolding puzzle. The most insignificant actions, adjusting a hat, smoothing a skirt, shifting weight from one foot to another, hinted at hidden anxiety and potential deceit. By midday, the village had coalesced around the idea that Mr. Price was the likely culprit. The gossip was loud enough to echo across the gardens and lanes, creating a pressure that Miss Marple found telling. People were desperate for closure, for a narrative that made sense even if it was entirely wrong. And it was precisely this eagerness, she realized, that allowed the true murderer to remain hidden in plain sight. Yet, as she surveyed the scene, her attention was drawn to a small, seemingly insignificant detail, the postman's satchel. It lay slightly to one side, the clasp bent, the flap uneven. There was a small smudge of mud on one corner, hardly noticeable, but enough to suggest movement or disturbance that no one else had considered. Miss Marple filed it away quietly, knowing that the simplest overlooked clue often held the key to unraveling the entire mystery. The day wore on with little resolution. Inspector Craddock's attention remained fixed on Mr. Price, while Miss Marple continued her subtle observations. She spoke briefly with the postman's widow, Mrs. Hargreaves, who was, as expected, in shock. Her grief was genuine, yet it was tempered by moments of striking composure. Miss Marple noted the way her eyes flicked towards certain villagers and then quickly away, as if she had seen things she could not yet articulate aloud. As evening approached, the villagers dispersed, each carrying with them a version of the story that suited their fears and prejudices. Mr. Price returned home under the watchful eyes of the constable, his protests mingling with murmurs of suspicion from those passing in the lane. Miss Marple, however, was already thinking ahead. The obvious suspect, she knew, was rarely the true culprit. Human behavior, she reminded herself, was a labyrinth of motives, lies, and half-truths. The gardener's offhand comment about a late-night visitor, the vicar's subtle discomfort when discussing the postman, the way young Timothy had fidgeted, these were the threads she would follow. That night, as the village settled into uneasy quiet, Miss Marple reviewed everything she had observed. The early investigation had produced no clear answers, only more questions and more patterns to be untangled. Somewhere among the villagers, the real murderer had concealed themselves, hidden behind layers of fear, misdirection, and human frailty. And Miss Marple, with her quiet patience and unwavering attention, knew that the first misdirection, the focus on Mr. Price, was exactly what the true culprit had counted on. The real test, she understood, would come in the days ahead, as secrets began to surface and human nature revealed itself in its most telling forms. The morning air in St. Mary Mead was crisp, carrying with it the faint scent of newly tilled earth and the blossoms of spring. Miss Marple, having spent the previous evening quietly reviewing her observations, set out early to revisit the orchard where Mr. Hargreaves had met his untimely end. The villagers had begun to return to their routines, though the usual ease of conversation was laced with tension, and every glance seemed to carry a trace of suspicion. Miss Marple's first stop was the postman's satchel, which had been carefully preserved at the Hargreaves' home. She examined it meticulously, noting once again the bent clasp and the subtle smear of mud. Nothing about the satchel indicated a struggle, yet the positioning of the small slip of paper protruding from one corner struck her as peculiar. It was a brief note, written in hurried handwriting but only partially legible. Words like meeting and late could be made out, while the remainder was obscured by a fold. The simple detail might have escaped the notice of anyone else, but Miss Marple knew that even minor anomalies often held significance. She carefully pocketed the note, intending to cross-reference it with the accounts she had gathered from the villagers. Often it was the smallest, seemingly insignificant clue that could expose the hidden motivations behind a crime. Her walk took her next to Timothy Barton, the young boy who had assisted Mr. Hargreaves. Timothy was sitting near the village green, idly kicking at small stones, though his expression betrayed continued anxiety. "Timothy," Miss Marple began gently, "do you recall if Mr. Hargreaves received any unusual letters or messages in the days before?" "Well, you know." The boy hesitated, then nodded reluctantly. He mentioned someone writing to him in a strange way. He didn't say who, but he looked worried about it. His eyes flicked nervously toward a row of cottages, as though he feared being overheard. Miss Marple's mind worked swiftly, noting the connection between the hurried note in the satchel and Timothy's recollection. Someone had been communicating with Mr. Hargreaves, and the content of these messages had evidently unsettled him. The timing suggested a link to the night of his death, and this became the first thread she intended to follow closely. Her next visit was to the Fairlawn estate, where she spoke with the gardener, Mr. Ellison. The man was a quiet, methodical sort, his hands perpetually soiled from tending the grounds. He recounted seeing the postman deliver letters late in the evening, noting that Mr. Hargreaves had seemed preoccupied, almost distracted, and had lingered longer than usual near the orchard gate. "He appeared to be waiting for someone," Mr. Ellison said thoughtfully. "I couldn't see who it was, but he glanced around several times, as if expecting trouble." Miss Marple made a note of this carefully. A meeting had been anticipated, a visitor had been expected, and yet the postman had encountered violence before he could complete whatever errand or conversation had been planned. The picture, though incomplete, began to take shape. Someone had arranged for the postman to be in the orchard at a specific time, perhaps knowing he would be alone. Returning home briefly, Miss Marple spread out her notes, cross-referencing statements, timing, and small details. She realized that the outwardly calm demeanor of certain villagers, their almost imperceptible glances and gestures, was consistent with someone hiding information rather than mere shock. The observation of human behavior, rather than forensic evidence, was beginning to reveal patterns that the police had overlooked entirely. As the afternoon drew on, she decided to revisit Mrs. Pennyweather. The older lady was arranging flowers in her sitting room, her movements precise yet tense. "I keep thinking about last night," Mrs. Pennyweather confessed, her voice softer than usual. "I did hear something, a shadow of movement near the gate, but I convinced myself it was only the wind." Miss Marple noted the hesitancy and the subtle attempt to minimize the event. Often people subconsciously downplayed what they had seen, fearing involvement or social repercussion. That shadow of movement might not have been the wind at all, and Miss Marple filed the observation carefully. Later, she took a quiet stroll along the lane, retracing the route that Mr. Hargreaves had taken on his final delivery. There was a subtle indentation in the earth near a side gate, barely visible beneath the morning dew. Miss Marple bent to examine it, noting the slight drag of a shoe, the shallow scuff in the soil, and the direction it suggested. The details were minute, yet they hinted at the path of someone who had come to meet the postman, someone familiar enough with the route to move cautiously, yet hurried enough to leave telltale signs. By evening, Miss Marple's deductions had coalesced into a clearer understanding. The murder was no impulsive act. It had been planned with some care, exploiting the village's routines and the postman's predictable behavior. Someone had communicated with him, anticipated his presence at the orchard, and manipulated circumstances so that he would be alone and vulnerable. As she prepared her evening tea, Miss Marple reflected on the day's revelations. The hidden clue, a simple note in the satchel, an unnoticed scuff in the earth, a shadow glimpsed by an anxious neighbor, had already provided more insight than the constable's exhaustive interviews. Human behavior, she thought, often concealed more truth than the most meticulous observations of a crime scene. And as the village of St. Mary Mead settled under the growing twilight, Miss Marple understood that the coming days would require careful attention, patience, and subtle questioning. The murderer had acted deliberately, leaving only the faintest traces behind. It was these traces, she knew, that would ultimately unravel the mystery and expose the hidden motives lurking among seemingly ordinary villagers. The village of St. Mary Mead seemed quieter than ever the next morning, though the tension beneath the calm was palpable. Villagers went about their routines with a subtle stiffness, exchanging wary glances and speaking in hushed tones, careful not to reveal too much. Miss Marple, however, moved among them with her usual quiet attentiveness, noting each gesture, each hesitation, each small sign of unease. She began her morning by visiting Mrs. Hargreaves, the widow of the unfortunate postman. The woman was sitting stiffly in her sitting room, her hands folded tightly in her lap, eyes fixed on the garden beyond. "It is unbearable," she whispered. "I cannot understand who would wish such harm on him. Everyone in the village loved Harold. Surely someone must have had a reason." Miss Marple listened patiently, allowing the widow's grief to settle into words. Yet beneath her sorrow there was a flicker of something else, subtle, almost imperceptible, a sense that she knew more than she was willing to say. Miss Marple made a mental note of it, Grief often masked other emotions, sometimes fear, sometimes shame, and occasionally a careful concealment of knowledge. Her next stop was the Fairlawn estate, where she sought out the household staff. The maid who had first discovered the body recounted the night's events with trembling hands and a voice that broke occasionally. She mentioned seeing a figure near the orchard gate, indistinct in the dim moonlight, moving with a careful deliberation that suggested intent. "I thought it might be Mr. Hargreaves himself," she admitted, "but he was already gone." Miss Marple thanked her quietly and left, her mind turning over every detail. The figure, however fleetingly glimpsed, hinted at premeditation, and the careful movement suggested someone familiar with the orchard. A stranger might have stumbled clumsily or hesitated in fear, but this person had moved with purpose. In the village square, whispers swirled. Mrs. Pennyweather and Mrs. Bantry spoke in urgent tones, speculating on motives and past grievances. "It might have something to do with old debts," Mrs. Pennyweather suggested, "or perhaps a family quarrel buried long ago. I have seen such things happen in other villages." Miss Marple's sharp eyes caught the subtle tension between the two women, each trying to assert moral authority while subtly revealing their own knowledge of village affairs. Miss Marple then turned her attention to Mr. Harold Price, still the focus of suspicion. The young handyman was tending to chores around his small cottage, his movements precise yet clearly shadowed by anxiety. She approached him gently. "Mr. Price," she said, "might you recall anyone behaving unusually in the days before Mr. Hargreaves's death? Even the smallest detail may be important." Price paused, wiping sweat from his brow. I saw Mr. Ellison, the gardener, late one evening. He seemed troubled and he was muttering to himself. But I don't think he would hurt anyone." His words were careful, measured, yet Miss Marple noted the hesitation and the quick glance toward the hedge, as if gauging whether someone had overheard. "The gardener." Mr. Ellison, when questioned, appeared composed but not entirely forthcoming. He admitted to seeing the postman linger near the orchard, but he claimed not to have noticed anything unusual. His hands, however, bore traces of fresh soil, in a pattern that suggested movement near the gate, contradicting his assertion that he had been entirely uninvolved. Throughout the afternoon, Miss Marple spoke with several other villagers, carefully probing memories and observations. She found that many had minor grievances or old quarrels with one another, small resentments that might seem inconsequential, but could provide the spark for more serious actions. A long-forgotten argument between two families, an unspoken slight, a matter of pride bruised, all surfaced quietly beneath the veneer of civility. Miss Marple began to see a network of relationships forming, a web of minor betrayals and tensions that connected the villagers in ways not immediately obvious. Every subtle expression, every carefully worded response, seemed to hint at a deeper knowledge or motive. Even the seemingly innocuous gossip carried fragments of truth if one knew how to interpret it correctly. By evening, the day had yielded more questions than answers. Miss Marple returned to her cottage, noting the patterns and anomalies she had observed. Certain villagers exhibited signs of discomfort. Some tried to steer conversations away from the postman, while others clung to seemingly trivial details with unusual intensity. Each behavior, she realized, could point toward hidden knowledge or complicity. As night fell, she reflected on the events and interactions of the day. The murder was no longer a simple act of violence, but a deliberate exploitation of human behavior, of trust and expectation. The clues were subtle, hidden in gestures, in brief hesitations, in what people chose not to say. The key, she understood, would be in gently drawing these truths into the open, using the natural tendencies of human nature against the perpetrator. The village might seem calm, the villagers returning to their routines, but Miss Marple knew that beneath the polite greetings and quiet domesticity, the truth was stirring. Each secret, each concealed resentment, each overlooked action would eventually converge, and the murderer, clever and careful though they were, would reveal themselves through their own behavior. And so, as the moonlight spilled over the quiet streets of St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple prepared herself for the days ahead, confident that the threads of deception would, in time, unravel before her patient observation and subtle inquiry. The following morning, St. Mary Mead awoke to a subtle unease that seemed to cling to every lane and garden. The villagers moved about their routines with more caution than usual, casting wary glances toward the orchard and whispering in hurried tones whenever they passed one another. Even the post office, normally a hub of cheerful chatter, seemed subdued, its windows reflecting the muted light of spring rather than the usual sparkle of daily activity. Miss Marple began her day with a walk along the lane leading to the orchard. The earth, still soft from the previous night's dew, bore traces of recent activity. Footprints, slight depressions, and a faint drag of something heavy. She examined each mark with patient care, noting directions, impressions, and overlaps that suggested more than one person had been present. The careful arrangement of these subtle details pointed to someone well aware of the terrain. Someone who could move through the village unnoticed if they chose. The village gossip had intensified overnight. Mrs. Pennyweather and Mrs. Bantry could be heard speculating in clipped tones, as if rehearsing theories rather than seeking the truth. "I don't believe it was Mr. Price," Mrs. Pennyweather whispered to her companion. "No, I think the gardener knows more than he admits. Mark my words, it is not so simple." Miss Marple listened without comment, but she noted the emphasis on the gardener. People often projected their fears or assumptions onto the most visible figures, overlooking the subtle manipulations of those who could move quietly and unnoticed. By mid-morning, a new revelation shook the village. Mrs. Hargreaves arrived at the post office in a state of distress, carrying a small bundle of letters she had found in her husband's satchel, letters that had previously escaped notice. The handwriting was unfamiliar, each note terse, containing cryptic instructions and a few words that suggested urgency. One letter, partially torn, hinted at a clandestine meeting scheduled near the orchard the night before the murder. The villagers gathered quickly, eager for any clue that might clarify the events of the previous night. The letters, however, did not point to the obvious suspect, Mr. Price, nor to any known visitor. Instead, they suggested the involvement of someone both trusted and inconspicuous, someone whose presence in the village might otherwise be overlooked. Miss Marple examined the letters quietly, her mind connecting threads. The language was concise, almost coded, indicating a person accustomed to secrecy and careful planning. The handwriting suggested impatience, a controlled urgency, but with occasional tremors that betrayed hidden anxiety. It was clear that the sender had not intended for these notes to be discovered, and yet their careless storage had ensured they survived the night. Meanwhile, the police had begun to expand their investigation. Inspector Craddock returned to the orchard, questioning anyone who might have been in the area. He focused heavily on the visible suspects, Price, the gardener, even the young Timothy Barton, but Miss Marple remained skeptical. The real culprit, she sensed, had anticipated such scrutiny and had maneuvered carefully to appear uninvolved. Later in the day, an unsettling incident occurred. A villager discovered a small package near the side gate of the orchard, wrapped hastily, and containing objects that hinted at a recent struggle. The discovery caused a renewed wave of speculation. Had the postman attempted to defend himself, or had the package been left deliberately to mislead investigators? The villagers debated the possibilities, each theory more fantastical than the last, while Miss Marple noted the discrepancies between the observed facts and the interpretations offered. She spent the afternoon retracing movements suggested by the letters, speaking discreetly with villagers who might have been present or aware of unusual comings and goings. Every word, every hesitation, and every diversion offered a fragment of insight. The patterns began to emerge. The postman had been lured, his routine exploited, and the perpetrator had taken great care to ensure that attention fell upon others. By evening, Miss Marple had pieced together a preliminary theory. The murder had not been an impulsive act, nor the result of a simple quarrel. It had been orchestrated with precision, exploiting human behavior, timing, and expectation. The real murderer had anticipated the reactions of those around them, relying on the village's tendency to misread motives and misplace suspicion. And yet, Miss Marple realized a single overlooked detail: the irregularity of a step, the misplacement of a letter, the subtle tremor in handwriting would be the thread that ultimately unraveled the deception. The new clues had shifted the focus, revealing a level of calculation and foresight that the villagers had not expected. As night settled over St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple reflected on the day's events. The apparent clarity of the investigation had been disrupted, and a deeper, more cunning layer of the mystery had revealed itself. The murderer, she understood, was someone who could navigate the ordinary life of the village unnoticed, masking their intentions beneath an unassuming exterior. She returned to her cottage, quietly reviewing her notes. The hidden threads of correspondence, the subtle traces near the orchard, and the villagers' own behavior formed a web that could, if carefully followed, reveal the truth. And Miss Marple, patient as ever, knew that the coming days would test her observation, intuition, and understanding of human nature to their fullest extent. The stage, she realized, was set for the subtle psychological games that would ultimately expose the murderer. Every villager, consciously or unconsciously, would play their part, and the careful observer would be ready to catch the slightest misstep. The following morning, St. Mary Mead stirred to life under a pale mist-laden sun. The village, though outwardly calm, carried the subtle tension of those who had begun to realize that the murder of Mr. Hargreaves had revealed far more than anyone had anticipated. Miss Marple, as always, moved quietly through the lanes, her sharp eyes noting gestures, pauses, and the slight shifts in posture that betrayed thought or worry. She decided that the day would be best spent testing the villagers through subtle observation rather than overt questioning. There were patterns to human behavior that revealed themselves only under gentle prodding, and she intended to watch closely who might stumble, falter, or reveal more than intended. Her first stop was the Fairlawn estate. The gardener, Mr. Ellison, was tending to the flower beds, his movements careful and measured. Miss Marple lingered at a discreet distance, observing his interactions with the household staff. He appeared composed, yet she noted a subtle stiffness in his shoulders and a slight hesitation when asked about the evening of the murder. It was the kind of detail a casual observer might overlook, but Miss Marple knew it spoke volumes. Next, she visited Mrs. Pennyweather, whose curiosity had intensified over the past days. They spoke of innocuous matters, the bloom of the tulips, the progress of the vegetable garden, and the arrival of spring's first swallows. Yet through these casual conversations, Miss Marple gently introduced references to the postman's last deliveries and the orchard, watching closely for any flicker of recognition, anxiety or discomfort. Mrs. Pennyweather's eyes, just for a moment, narrowed slightly, and she paused longer than necessary before answering a question about the letters. Miss Marple filed this away silently. Throughout the day she engaged with several other villagers, weaving seemingly casual mentions of the events into conversation. A question about a missing parcel here, a reference to a hurried note there, each carefully timed and framed to provoke subtle reactions. The goal was not to interrogate but to observe, to allow the natural tendencies of the villagers to reveal truths that words alone could not. In the early afternoon, she encountered Timothy Barton near the village green. The boy's unease was still evident, but Miss Marple spoke gently and without accusation. She allowed him to recount, in his own words, the final moments of the postman's deliveries. She paid close attention to his tone, the pacing of his sentences, and the direction of his gaze, noting moments of hesitation that suggested withheld knowledge or unspoken fear. By mid-afternoon, Miss Marple returned to the orchard, now cordoned off and quiet, the remnants of the investigation still visible. She walked slowly along the lane, observing footprints, soil impressions, and the position of the gate. As she traced the path of the postman's final steps, she subtly referenced the letters and the recent discoveries, watching to see if any passerby, hidden within their polite curiosity, reacted in a way that betrayed recognition or guilt. It was in the late afternoon, as shadows grew long, that the crucial moment arrived. Miss Marple had invited a small group of villagers to her cottage under the pretense of tea and conversation. She spoke of ordinary matters, gardening, local gossip, and the weather, but wove in mentions of the postman's routes, the letters, and the orchard. Each phrase was carefully constructed, each glance measured, each pause timed to invite reaction. The effect was subtle but unmistakable. One villager, whose composure had seemed unassailable in previous days, shifted visibly, their hands tightening around the teacup. Another avoided eye contact, nervously redirecting conversation. Miss Marple observed quietly, her mind cataloguing each micro-expression and gesture. These small reactions were far more revealing than words or confessions, for they betrayed instinctive responses to guilt and fear. As evening approached, Miss Marple had gathered a mental record of the critical details. The reactions of the villagers, when probed through gentle suggestion and casual remark, had illuminated the hidden dynamics at play. She could now distinguish between those whose behavior stemmed from shock or concern and the one whose every movement betrayed a carefully concealed culpability. By nightfall, she retired to her cottage, her knitting resting in her lap as her mind pieced together the complex web she had observed over the preceding days. The murderer had been hiding in plain sight, relying on the village's ordinary routines and social assumptions to mask their actions. Miss Marple sipped her tea, reflecting calmly. She had tested their reactions, observed their natural instincts, and allowed the human tendencies of fear, deception, and self-preservation to expose the truth. It was now only a matter of time before the careful alignment of evidence, observation, and subtle behavioral cues would allow her to confront the murderer directly. The village seemed quiet, serene even, but Miss Marple knew better. Beneath the polite facades and careful words, the threads of deception were taut and fragile. Soon the true pattern would emerge, and the murderer's own actions would betray them completely. The morning air in St. Mary Mead was still, almost unnervingly so, as if the village itself held its breath in anticipation. Miss Marple moved quietly through her garden, sipping tea and observing the soft sway of the blossoms in the gentle breeze. The days of subtle observations and careful questioning had brought her to this moment, the culmination of patient study and quiet deduction. She invited the key villagers to her cottage that afternoon under the pretense of a small gathering, a casual tea among neighbours. The vicar, Mrs. Pennyweather, Mrs. Bantry, Timothy Barton, Mr. Ellison, and reluctantly, Mr. Harold Price accepted the invitation, unaware that the meeting would serve as the stage for the truth to emerge. Miss Marple's demeanour was as gentle as ever, her voice soft and inviting, her expressions neutral, giving no hint of the revelations to come. As the tea was poured and the conversation began, Miss Marple guided the discussion with subtle precision. She spoke of ordinary matters, the progress of the gardens, the peculiar weather, the comings and goings of villagers, carefully weaving in references to Mr. Hargreaves's last deliveries, the letters found in his satchel, and the disturbances near the orchard. Each mention was deliberate, designed to elicit a reaction, however fleeting, from those present. She first addressed Mr. Price in a casual tone. "I do hope your deliveries have returned to their usual schedule," she said lightly, "though I imagine yesterday must have unsettled even the most punctual among us." Price shifted uncomfortably, glancing toward the window, his eyes betraying the strain of persistent suspicion, yet revealing nothing further. Miss Marple's gaze then lingered on Mr. Ellison, the gardener. "It is remarkable how familiar one can become with the orchard paths," she remarked. "Some people have a knack for moving quietly, without disturbing a single leaf." Mr. Ellison stiffened, his hands clenching briefly around his teacup. Miss Marple allowed a moment to pass, then continued, her voice unhurried. The room's attention shifted subtly as she recounted details of the postman's last evening, how he lingered at the orchard gate, the misplaced letters, the slight scuffs in the soil, and the hurried note found in the satchel. Each villager absorbed the details, some reacting unconsciously, a twitch of a hand, a downward glance, a stiffened posture. Miss Marple paused, her eyes sweeping across the room. "It is often the smallest details that reveal the truth," she said softly. "A bent clasp, a faint smudge, a step out of place. These are things that might be overlooked, yet they speak volumes about human intentions." She looked directly at Mr. Ellison, her tone calm, almost conversational. "And it is remarkable how someone familiar with these paths could orchestrate events to appear entirely innocent." Mr. Ellison's eyes widened slightly, the briefest flicker of recognition crossing his face. He attempted to reply, but his voice faltered, and a nervous cough escaped him. Miss Marple's observation sharpened. The careful balance of composure he had maintained was breaking, revealing the truth that had eluded others. "I believe," Miss Marple continued, her voice gentle yet precise, "that the orchestrator of this crime relied on appearances. They counted on the village's trust, the predictable behavior of Mr. Hargreaves, and the eagerness of others to point fingers elsewhere. But even the most meticulous plans leave subtle traces, footsteps, gestures, inconsistencies in a story. And these, when observed with patience, reveal the guilty party. The room grew tense. Mr. Ellison's posture slumped, and he finally spoke, his voice low and hesitant. I did not mean for it to happen. I only wanted to frighten him, to make him reconsider what he had done. I did not intend—" His words trailed off, defeated as the weight of exposure settled upon him. Miss Marple nodded gently, her expression sympathetic yet resolute. "Your intentions, while perhaps not fully malicious, led to the tragedy of Mr. Hargreaves's death. You underestimated the consequences of manipulating human behavior, and your careful plan ultimately betrayed you." The villagers reacted with a mixture of shock and relief. Mr. Price breathed freely, Timothy Barton looked up with wide eyes, and even the vicar's stern face softened with understanding. Mrs. Pennyweather murmured quietly about the danger of hidden resentments, while Mrs. Bantry shook her head in disbelief at how human nature had concealed motives beneath ordinary appearances. Miss Marple continued, explaining the chain of events in precise detail, how the letters had been written and placed to guide the postman to the orchard, how the minor disturbances in the soil and gate had revealed the presence of someone familiar with the path, and how the subtle behavioral cues of the villagers had confirmed her deductions. Each seemingly trivial observation, each understated action, had been a critical piece of the puzzle. By the time the explanation concluded, the villagers had absorbed the full scope of the deception and the careful orchestration behind Mr. Hargreaves's murder. Miss Marple's gentle yet incisive reasoning had unraveled a complex web, showing how human behavior, more than any physical evidence, had held the key to the mystery, the guilty party. Mr. Ellison was quietly led away by Inspector Craddock, still stunned by the meticulous unraveling of events. The village, while shaken, began the slow process of returning to normal, their trust in ordinary appearances forever tempered by the knowledge that even the quietest corners of St. Mary Mead could conceal profound intentions. Miss Marple returned to her cottage that evening, calm and composed. She reflected on the nature of human behavior, the interplay of fear, deception, and hidden motives. Though the village would resume its routines, a subtle awareness had settled among its residents, a reminder that the ordinary could conceal extraordinary truths, and that careful observation and patience were often the most powerful tools in uncovering them. The days following Mr. Ellison's arrest brought a cautious calm to St. Mary Mead. The village resumed its routines with a subdued rhythm, as if the previous turbulence had left a lingering shadow over even the simplest of tasks. Children played quietly in the lanes, villagers exchanged greetings that carried a careful warmth, and the market square buzzed once more with the modest energy of everyday life. Yet beneath the surface, a quiet awareness lingered, an understanding that even in a tranquil village, human nature could harbor hidden depths of secrecy and cunning. Miss Marple observed the village from the comfort of her garden, her keen eyes noting every subtle gesture and fleeting expression. The post office had reopened, and Mrs. Hargreaves, though still grieving, had begun sorting letters with meticulous care, her movements steady and deliberate. Miss Marple offered her a warm smile when she passed by, appreciating the woman's quiet resilience and her effort to reclaim a sense of normalcy. Throughout the village, there was a renewed sense of attentiveness. Villagers spoke more carefully, their actions measured as if the revelation of the previous crime had sharpened their perception of one another. Gossip persisted naturally, but it was tempered with a degree of caution. People had seen firsthand how assumptions could mislead, how appearances could conceal intentions, and how subtle behavior could reveal truths hidden from casual observation. Miss Marple spent her mornings walking the familiar lanes, greeting neighbors and observing their interactions. She noticed that Mr. Price had regained some of his composure, tending to his chores without the nervous tension that had marked him in the days after the murder. Timothy Barton, though still shy, moved with a lighter step, and even Mrs. Pennyweather's habitual commentary was softened by reflection rather than suspicion. One afternoon, Miss Marple visited the orchard, now quiet and orderly. The gate, once ajar and suspicious, was repaired, and the soft earth showed no sign of disturbance. She walked slowly along the path, her mind tracing the movements of those involved, recalling the subtle clues, gestures, and inconsistencies that had ultimately revealed the truth. Each detail, once overlooked or dismissed, now fit into a coherent pattern of human behavior, motives, and concealed intentions. As the sun dipped low in the sky, casting long shadows across the village, Miss Marple returned home to her modest cottage. She reflected on the nature of the events that had transpired, recognizing that while the crime had caused disruption and sorrow, it had also illuminated the intricate interplay of character, habit, and human folly. The murder had been a tragedy, yes, but it had also revealed the strength, courage, and discernment present within the quiet routines of village life. Her thoughts turned to the lessons the case had offered, the importance of patience in observation, the subtle power of intuition, and the understanding that human behavior often carries truths far beyond what words or appearances suggest. The villagers, in their varied ways, had played roles in both concealing and revealing these truths, their actions ultimately contributing to the resolution of the mystery. Evening settled gently over St. Mary Mead. The soft glow of lanterns illuminated windows, and the scent of freshly baked bread and blooming flowers mingled in the cooling air. Miss Marple sat in her favorite chair, knitting resting in her lap, eyes focused on the flickering flames of the hearth. She considered the people of the village, their strengths, weaknesses, and quiet idiosyncrasies, and felt a deep satisfaction in having untangled the web of deceit that had disrupted their lives. Though the village had returned to its outward tranquility, Miss Marple knew that beneath the calm, the lessons of the past days would linger. People had been reminded of the delicate balance between trust and suspicion, of the hidden motives that could shape actions, and of the enduring complexity of human nature. It was a balance she had long understood and observed, one that allowed her to see clearly where others might only perceive ordinary routines. As night enveloped the village, Miss Marple placed her knitting aside, the quiet satisfaction of resolved mystery settling over her. The orchard gate remained closed, the letters sorted, and the villagers for the moment returned to their ordinary lives. Yet the awareness of hidden truths, subtle behaviors, and the intricate patterns of human nature remained, a quiet echo of the events that had unfolded, and Miss Marple, calm and contemplative, knew that while the village would endure, life itself remained an ever-unfolding tapestry of secrets, observations, and revelations, each waiting for the patient eye to discern, the quiet mind to untangle, and the gentle yet firm hand to guide toward understanding.